everybody. I'm Ayla Jorgensen, and today we will be looking at two texts by Ralph Waldo Emerson, um, and particularly what these two texts tell us about American Transcendentalism as a movement. Um, these texts are American Scholar and Self-Reliance. Okay, so first, I think it's important to examine this word because it seems pretty daunting to understand, um, which is totally unreasonable feeling considering it has 17 letters in it. Um, so if we were to look at transcendentalism more broadly, it's actually had many iterations throughout cultures and throughout history. But its kind of core idea asserts that the human ability to transcend the materialistic world of sense experience and facts and to become conscious of the all-pervading spirit of the universe and the potential of humans to connect to it. So you heard the word transcend in there, and it's the ability of humans to go beyond their surroundings to connect to the divine, is one way to put it. So, for our context, I think it would be useful to discuss what the transcendentalism of early 19th century America was. So, to be more specific, the transcendentalism that we are concerned with is the 19th century movement of writers and philosophers in New England who were loosely bound together by adherence to an idealistic system of thought based on a belief in the essential unity of all creation, the innate goodness of humanity, and the supremacy of insight over logic, and experience for the revelation of the deepest truths. So we kind of heard some core ideas that connected these thinkers. But if we were to kind of further simplify them, one is the inherent goodness of individuals, which is a really important one. The importance of intuition and intellect, a deep connection to nature, the belief that individuals can directly experience the divine through their own inner understanding, and a rejection of societal norms and institutions that hinder personal growth. And that last one is important to note, particularly the ones that hinder personal growth. It's not a rejection of all societal norms, institutions, but just the ones that don't allow people to transcend, if that makes sense. So, because transcendentalism is all about rejecting dogma, I think this quote shows how we are meant to consider the ideas that are put forth by this movement. So, the principles of transcendentalism are to be felt as religious emotions, or grasped by the imagination as a poetic whole. They are not to be proved, neither are they to be set down in proportion as the articles of a creed. The truth comes to us not when we are critical, not when we are working, but when we are receptive and passive. The knowledge thus conveyed does not require to be defined. Its foundation need not be strengthened. So, this kind of gets at the heart of how this movement is really about the human experience, about intuition, about when you arrive at these ideas, they'll make sense to you because we all have this ability to connect to truth. So again, it's hard to define, but I think this quote kind of puts it in a really like a nutshell. So moving on to our main character, now that we have a basic understanding of this movement as a whole, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Fun fact, he actually went by Waldo for most of his life, which I think is really funny. So here's a little quote by him that I thought was cool. Hitch your wagon to a star, which I think really speaks to like his overall throughout his life. He always just had this like optimism about human potential. And I think this demonstrates that. So it's hard to measure this man's influence because he's kind of always been auspicious. Like in his lifetime, he was well respected. And afterwards, his influence only grew. And so now he's actually considered to be among America's greatest thinkers and one of our first truly great authors, which speaks to his role in helping to form American identity. So, at any rate, his contributions to Transcendentalism were paramount, as this quote demonstrates. Were it not for Emerson's writing, New England Transcendentalism would be as good as forgotten for us. For 3/4 of a century, Emerson's personality and writings have become so well fused with Transcendentalism that to attempt to dissociate them today is a vain task. So, you can see he carries national importance, but he also carries almost paramount importance to this entire movement, that they almost cannot be disentangled from each other, who he was as a person and the movement that he espoused. So, I'm not going to attempt to do an in-depth biography of Emerson. I just really want to highlight in this slide his religious background because it is important to understanding his basic philosophy, although maybe not in the way that you might think. So, Emerson was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1803. Emerson's father was a Unitarian minister that came from a long line of clergymen. After graduating from Harvard, Emerson went on to attend divinity school, and after being ordained in 1829, he became a minister himself. He served at a church in Boston for 3 years before he decided to walk away from the ministry. So we can see this like generations long connection to the church. And we know that later in life, while he ultimately found organized religion to be inadequate, he always retains a solid belief in the divine and the ability of every human to access it through their own enlightenment. So from here until the end of his life, he would move into his role as an American essayist, lecturer, philosopher, abolitionist, and poet, and eventually leader of the Transcendentalist movement in New England. And this quote really demonstrates that he never lost this like strong spirituality. Emerson was loyal to all truth without loss of reverence. He never abandoned his faith in the supremacy of the divine in the world. This was a faith which could watch without dismay, indeed with eager sympathy, the progress of the intellect. So he never saw this like mutually exclusive relationship between believing in human potential and human intellect as a rejection of God. This whole kind of movement is about kind of marrying those two ideas, which I personally find very fascinating. So this brief look at Emerson's life actually provides us with the perfect microcosm in which to understand New England in the early 19th century. Like Emerson, America was dealing with its own complicated religious legacy. So just like in his life, like it's early 1800s, he's in New England, he's coming from a long line of clergymen. It is essentially the story of the entire identity of New England at this time. So when we're looking at the rise of Transcendentalism, when it began in New England in the early 1800s, it was born of a reaction to the Industrial Revolution and the perceived materialism and dehumanization it caused, as well as a response to the perceived spiritual inadequacy of established religion. So just as Emerson was gaining spiritual heights by leaving the ministry, New England was kind of looking for something that would be more satisfying than the religion that they had like always known. So, but we see later, the Transcendentalists operated from the start with the sense that the society around them was seriously deficient. As the 19th century came to its midpoint, the Transcendentalists' dissatisfaction with their society became focused on policies and actions of the United States government. So we see kind of in the latter half of the influence of the movement, most influential time of the movement, that they are starting to like have more civic engagement. And they deeply condemned these actions by the US government, the treatment of the Native Americans, particularly the forced removal of the Cherokee to Oklahoma, the war with Mexico, which a lot of Transcendentalists saw as like a imperialistic power grab, and the continuing and expanding practice of slavery. So this last one was huge. Abolition actually became a core tenet of the movement, and they kind of were at the forefront of the whole effort. So now that we have established an understanding of the movement and its context, we can now turn to our text. So first we'll look at The American Scholar, which was an oration Emerson delivered at his alma mater, Harvard, in 1837. I am including this quote because I think it gets at the heart of what Emerson's message was. Our day of dependence, our long apprenticeship to the learning of other lands, draws to a close. So, if we were to look at themes in The American Scholar and draw out the most important kind of ideas in this oration, um, we will see that Emerson strongly advocates for the reception of European philosophy from American thought, declaring that we have listened too long to the courtly muses of Europe. He calls for a fresh American thought identity, born of thinkers in our own land, firmly grounded in American soil, who have learned to trust their own intellect and to be guided by their natural intuition. These thinkers must necessarily seek out more pure forms of knowledge. Emerson insists that real scholars learn from nature, from the proper use of books, and from experience. So those last three themes can kind of be broken down further. So those three forms of more pure knowledge are nature. Nature conceals underlying laws that are at the same time laws of the human mind. He kind of talked about, and there's also an essay called Nature that goes more in depth with this idea, that when humans are experiencing nature, they're kind of seeing a reflection of themselves. So it's this knowledge that helps them honestly see themselves better. The proper relation to books is not of the bookworm, but of the creative reader who uses books as a stimulus to inspire the active soul. There's kind of a funny quote somewhere where he says, there's no useful book that, or the only useful books are those published within the last year or something. So he's really trying to get this idea that a lot of knowledge that's taught in universities, and he's speaking to scholars at a university, are ideas that were passed down by people who read a lot of books, and then and they're reading the books of those who also read a lot of books. And so he talks about getting to a more tangible knowledge that each person can kind of experience for themselves, which gets at our last point. Emerson states that action provides the experience from which the true scholar develops his own natural understanding, freeing him from the temptation to imitate others. So he really gets into this idea that life is your dictionary, that life will teach you things that no books can, and that that's like such a pure form of knowledge because it's not imitated. It's your own experience. It's your own life. So we're going to look at a quote that we can kind of see Emerson, like why this matters so much to him. Like we can see what he thinks is at stake here. The spirit of the American freeman is always suspected to be timid, imitative, tame. The mind of this country, taught to aim at low objects, eats upon itself. Young men of the fairest promise, who begin life upon our shores, inflated by the mountain winds, shined upon by all the stars of God, find the earth below not in unison with these. We will walk on our own feet. We will work with our own hands. We will speak our own minds. A nation of men will for the first time exist because each believes himself inspired by the divine soul. Which is just a really powerful quote. I think this last line especially, um, a nation of men will for the first time exist because each believes himself inspired by the divine soul, is like the perfect segue to getting into our next text, um, self-reliance. And this essay is actually one of Emerson's most famous works and was published in 1841. Um, and here's a quote that really synthesizes the message. Um, Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. So we'll see, we'll definitely see as we look at this one, um, how this text really embodies a core tenet of this entire movement, which is learning to rely on the self. Okay, so some themes in self-reliance. The way Emerson lays out his doctrine of self-sufficiency and self-reliance naturally springs from his view that the individual need only look into his own heart for the spiritual guidance that has up to this point been the domain of the established churches. The individual must then have the courage to be himself and to trust the inner force within him as he lives his life according to his intuition. Um, for Emerson, God could best be found by looking inward into one's own self, and from such an enlightened self awareness would in turn come freedom of action and the ability to change one's world according to the dictates of one's ideals and conscience. So, if we're to look closer at this term self reliance, we can see that it kind of presupposes a reliable self. If you're to like flip it backwards, in which to place one's trust. So it's essential to understand what is this self that he speaks of. So the self must encompass an innate goodness, with which we are all imbued by the divine, individual intuition, the understanding born of the soul in touch with its innate goodness, um, and lastly, self-trust, in which we are able to express that innate goodness and that intuition, um, unhindered by societal expectations and norms. So all those thoughts, they like those three, they're all like deeply connected. But in reading Self-Reliance, you see this kind of optimism and this urging to know yourself better because only you can access this enlightenment that you have been given. Um, and that it's a divine power. Um, so we're going to look at a quote. In this quote, we see the insistence with which Emerson speaks of learning to think your own thoughts and be your own person. Insist on yourself. Never imitate. Your own gift you can present every moment with the cumulative force of a whole life's cultivation. But of the adoptive talent of another, you have only an extemporaneous half possession. That which each can do best, none but his maker can teach him. And lastly, I wanted to include another passage from Self-Reliance that I found particularly powerful. No law can be sacred to me, but that of my nature. Good and bad are but names very readily transferable to that or this. The only right is what is after my constitution, the only wrong, what is against it. So, to me, this quote sums up Ralph Waldo Emerson's most basic belief that the only good that is to be found in this world is to be found in each and every one of us and in our ability to access and express our soul's potential. Hitch your wagon to a star. Here are my sources. Thank you for watching.